Oh geez, it's recording now.
Recording in progress.
Hey everybody, welcome. Hey everybody, welcome. Hey everybody, welcome. Thanks for being here. Give folks another couple minutes to get logged on. Hi Jose, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We'll give folks just another couple minutes to log on here. What's the weather like up in Minneapolis today?
And it got up to 57, so we'll take it.
Hey, that's pretty good. That's nice.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're a little warmer in Omaha.
Yeah, no, the feelings.
Give folks like 2 minutes to hop on. Great. Okay. Well, I'll keep admitting people as they log on tonight. A few people let me know that they couldn't make it. So we are recording this. It'll be posted on YouTube for those who couldn't make it. I guess just a couple of really quick mode shift announcements. First of all, thanks to everybody who came out to any of our Do Good Days events last week. We had a really great week. If you didn't get a chance to make a donation or would still like to make a donation for Do Good Days, I'm going to throw a link in the chat for folks. In terms of upcoming meetings, we have our bike team meeting is next up. That is going to be on Tuesday, May 2nd. Here's a link for that in case you want to register. And then our next walkability team meeting is on May 10th at 7. Also put the link in the chat to register for that. A couple of other events, these will be posted later this week. We're going to do a happy hour at Dry Spokes on Leavenworth, which is a dry bar. They don't serve alcohol. We're going to go from 5:30 to 6:30 just to chat and be social. And something else that's in the works is a group bike ride on Saturday, May 20th. It's going to start at 9 a.m. We're going to bike to the Luminarium. With Manny, we're going to go over to Fabric Labs and hang out at Spark CDI for a little bit. So lots of fun things to look forward to in May with the nicer weather. That'll be awesome. Any other mode shift events, things happening that I didn't catch that folks should know about? Okay, seeing shaking of heads from team leads.
Just
Oh,
real quick,
Stuart.
we do have a coffee ride on the second Saturday in May. We're going to
That's
be
perfect.
going to the mill on Leavenworth.
Awesome. So that'll be on May 13th, that Saturday. And we'll get that
Correct.
posted up online if we haven't done that yet either. Awesome. Okay, well, I'm gonna give Jose a short introduction. We're so excited that you're here, Jose. I've been looking forward to this for like months, it feels like. So I'm just gonna read a little bit of your bio and then give the floor to you to give your presentation, and then we'll do a Q&A after. Jose has an incredibly impressive resume and bio, so I'm gonna read a little bit more of it than I would have, but bear with me because it's all really cool. José Antonio Zayas Cabán is the advocacy director for Our Streets Minneapolis, where he has worked on developing reparative justice campaigns across the Twin Cities. He's also a 2023 board member at the Alliance and Streets Minneapolis and finished serving as co-convener and advisory board member in a climate and mobility justice campaign that aims to increase multimodal transportation and reduce vehicle miles traveled and improve equitable access to transportation infrastructure across the state of Minnesota. In addition, as a 2022-2023 Mapping Prejudice Project Community Fellow, Jose will also be conducting research into the intersections between racial covenants, transportation, housing, and land use, and developing a workbook on how to address these issues through an integrated approach to advocacy. He's also an author and a musician and has done a ton of really cool things with Our Streets Minneapolis. So I'll let you take it from here, Jose, and tell us about all the great work you're doing.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction. It's nice to meet you all. I'm going to get right to it. This is the second time anyone will get to see this presentation. As part of my fellowship with Mapping Prejudice Project, I was able to collaborate with Kirsten Delegard, their director. So I want to give her some credit. And Grace, if you can't see the presentation once I share, let me know. These are tablet presentations out of my music studio. Okay, so let's hop over. And I bet my tablet is going to take an awkward second.
Maybe if you want to, Jose, I see me like up in the left-hand corner if you want to minimize that.
What you mean you?
Oh, yeah, now it's in like the bottom right-hand corner.
Yeah, you can just see my screen now. Let me see if there we go.
Perfect. Yep.
Okay, so like I said, I want to give Kirsten credit for this part of the presentation and Mapping Prejudice Project for their support. And it's a big part of how we do our work now at Our Streets Minneapolis, both in terms of conducting historical and archival research, but also telling stories about the communities that were impacted by transportation infrastructure decisions. So the first thing, just wanted to briefly talk about racial covenants and basically what they are. They are clauses that were inserted in property records that prohibited people who were not white from buying or occupying pieces of land. And this example here is the first one that Mapping Prejudice found in the state of Minnesota from 1910. It's for a house in South Minneapolis, stipulates that the premises shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. And this starts to kind of set the frame for the kind of work that we are doing now. There's been a lot of questions about whether or not this work should continue to be done and should these volunteers continue to research covenants. But we feel that in order for us to repair the harms that were done to these communities, we first need to uncover, acknowledge, and leverage this history. And in particular, today, I'm here to talk to you about one of our projects and sort of an emblem of how we do our work, which is 6th Avenue North. And this is a picture of 6th Avenue North in Lindale, because we feel that stories motivate us to act. And stories are usually the best way to get people to understand how we got here and also help encourage them to take some action. 6th Avenue North, since we're not from Minneapolis, is in North Minneapolis, which is basically a sort of the northwest quadrant of the city. And it used to be home to a thriving, walkable, dense neighborhood community with businesses, with community gathering spaces, and it was primarily a Black and Jewish cultural corridor in North Minneapolis. So here's just another photo of a restaurant that existed during that time. And we're centering on 6th Avenue because this sort of city kind of loomed large in the imagination of Minneapolis for a time, but its history was sort of erased as it was replaced by what is now Olson Memorial Highway. And with that construction, the story of 6th Avenue North was sort of lost. And Kirsten has done a tremendous job of researching that history and in a way bringing it back to life with the storytelling and a lot of these slides that she's able to share with us about things that used to be there on the corridor. And in particular, 6th and Lindale was sort of a prominent intersection where there was just a lot of business and there was a lot of bustling and there was a lot of foot traffic. And now that intersection, as you can see here, is sort of a junction for Interstate 94, Olson Memorial Highway, Lindale Avenue. It also happens to be in city of Minneapolis, high injury crash network for most fatal crashes in the city of Minneapolis. And what she was able to uncover, and one of the really cool things about this presentation, the storytelling that we're trying to tell, was former North Minneapolis resident Clarence Miller, during his time away from Minnesota, decided to recall his neighborhood and drew these very detailed maps of what used to be in these areas. And this is basically the only account that we have of what was there because it was so poorly archived. But it's really interesting to see all of the density in that area. And I have here a description of how Miller described coming of age in the neighborhood. He said, since the Negro was restricted from the downtown entertainment, the avenue, which is how it was referred to sometimes, was their only outlet for enjoyment after 6 days of hard labor on their jobs in those years. On most of those warm Sunday evenings, there were times where the sidewalks on both sides of the street were crowded with people coming or going, sometimes 4 or 5 abreast from Lindale to Bryant Avenue. Miller basically trace the footprints of 5 churches, pool halls, 5 nightclubs, 13 restaurants, in this photo, after-hour spots. The local media described the avenue as an upper Midwestern version of Memphis' famous Beale Street. And people from different ethnicities were drawn to the intersection to basically party, to hang out, to worship, to go to gatherings, to have food. It was just a place that was both safe for a diverse group of people, but it was also a place that sort of thrived as a cultural center for Black and Jewish Americans. Like in those times, part of feeling safe was the fact that there were groups in and around the city of Minneapolis that were making communities of color feel threatened and unsafe. And this was no different in the city of Minneapolis, like the University of Minnesota. And so 6th Avenue North represented sort of a safe space for people to live well amongst one another without the threats that were sort of looming in and around the city. And I'm gonna skip over some of these things a little bit more quickly. Kirsten presented them because of time. But then later on, we start moving in the direction of what started to happen in and across the United States. And it's that there was sort of a push in real estate, there was sort of a push in infrastructure development for new urbanism that sort of eradicated areas that were designated as slums, areas that were redlined, and the community along 6th Avenue North was no different. And Olson Memorial Highway, curiously enough, is sort of it's the earliest example in the state of Minnesota of a community selected for destruction to make way for the highway. But this was done sort of intentionally in tandem with the idea that communities had to be de-integrated or once again segregated at the turn of the 20th century. And so this is a photo of a business owner who was basically indicating that they had to stay until they were evicted because they really had nowhere to go. Let's see, and I think the quote that I have here says, "I've hunted, but I can't find the place." He said, "I guess I'll just sit tight." And here we have sort of what mapping prejudice is kind of famous for. It's the sheer amount of racial covenants that were sort of installed in the city of Minneapolis over those years. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I'll let the time lapse go so you can basically see how much of the land was protected for white community members, and the difficulty that community members who were being displaced by the development of a highway like Olson Highway and just in general the interstate infrastructure, how difficult it was for them to move to other areas because they had nowhere to go. And in particular, move to areas where there were amenities and walkable amenities in the same sort of cultural feel as they were experiencing when 6th Avenue North was still thriving. This also coincided with sort of a national movement in real estate, which kind of helped modernize the real estate industry to basically look for opportunities to segregate communities by valuing them differently. And this is where redlining sort of helps. It creates an opportunity to devalue an area like the area in near North Minneapolis. And as property values go down, that is very, very difficult for communities to pick themselves up, but also it sort of starts to discourage new investment from coming in. So as the real estate industry was evolving to support these segregationist practices, neighborhoods like near North were sort of starting to become more and more divested. And I have here just another map, in terms of like things that were happening at the same time to make people feel discouraged. This also coincided with the fact that terror lynchings and other sort of intimidating tactics were being used when communities of color were trying to find places to live and places to go. Of course, Jim Crow laws were emerging as well. And so it was really creating kind of a stressful situation for these communities without anywhere to go. And many of them were sort of being displaced, moved farther away from the city, but some of them just remained in the area as the area was sort of divested and devalued. I'm gonna skip this one. Okay, and then here is a map that I want to present and starting to lead into the work that we do at Our Streets, Minneapolis. You can see with the racial covenants that I showed earlier that Mapping Prejudice has researched really well that there was more diversity across the city of Minneapolis at the beginning of the 19th century, the 20th century, and as the racial covenants started to become more prominent, there was sort of a reconcentration of communities of color in the same areas where eventually the highways were built. And just a photo here of one of the families that was displaced and struggled with finding housing was the parents of Prince, the artist that we all know very well, was a North Minneapolis resident. And unfortunately, during that time, at that young age, the family had to also find ways to relocate. Okay, and I'm gonna see if I can. Here's a map of Minneapolis and some of the redlining practices that happen. I realize that you all are less familiar with the city of Minneapolis, but again, if you look at the northwest quadrant, that's where near North Community is. So you see that yellow on top of that red. There's sort of a red line that streaks across the yellow in the left-hand map. That's more or less where Olson Highway is. Once again, it's just a little bit more up close of the near North Community. And with that, the other thing that we like to talk about is that communities, in order for these justifications to sort of take place for redlining or new urbanism or displacement or disinvestment, oftentimes there was a lot of negative press coverage. So it's this idea of creating consent around demonizing communities and sort of subhumanizing them to make people feel like it's more dangerous to live in these areas, and to eventually create sort of like a consent of justification from community members that it is okay to destroy these communities by developing infrastructure on top of their neighborhoods. Okay. And then I'm gonna skip through this here a little more quickly again. This is an example of a series of sociology maps that were sort of christened as academic maps. I'll go back to this one. I'll let you read through some of the designations of some of the neighborhoods, but this basically, these sort of ecological and statistical studies basically were part of this effort to concentrate community members in certain areas and also research certain areas for development for wealthier and primarily wealthy white community members. So for example, you can see down on the bottom left, there's an area called the Gold Coast, whereas just above that, you see a slum and it's sort of designated as the Negro section. So there was kind of a concerted effort coming from academia, from developers, from jurisdictions, all together to create this image around how segregation was going to help sort of clean up the cities and eliminate some of the threats that people are feeling, or sort of segregate community members, especially of color, who were sort of identified as more dangerous. Early on, you know, this is a photo of when the construction started and when things started to move along with the highway. This is a photo of sort of like breaking ground on the highway, the ribbon cutting. And this one I really like because I know a lot of you are more in transportation. This is sort of a from above view. There's a good Twitter page that I always recommend, Segregation by Design, that does these in animated form. But this is where 6th Avenue was, and you can see a lot of the density that existed in that area. And you can kind of see the scar that Olson Memorial Highway left on that same community. In a way, it's interesting because when you look at the map, the right-hand side, of course, the eastern side leads into what is downtown Minneapolis. Left-hand side now leads into a suburb. But initially, when the highway was cut through, there was nowhere to go. So there's this sort of a highway to nowhere. And almost 7 years after the highways was built, is one of the least used highways in the state of Minnesota. So it really was a very intentional destruction of a neighborhood for its own sake. It didn't really add any value in transportation. And right now, Olson Highway is still used less than some avenues in the city of Minneapolis. Okay. So these are some of the different stages of the highway once again. Okay. And this is just a little bit of kind of starting to get more and more into our work. During that time and moving into the 50s and 60s, we start seeing the emergence of what's called the interstate system or the highway system. And at the time, it was also labeled after the military, right? The interstate and defense highway system. And as we know now, many of the communities that were sort of sacrificed for the development of these highways were communities of color. The state of Minnesota, almost 80% of the community members that were displaced by the emergence of the interstate system were Black Americans. It's something like 20,000 people all in all. And so kind of going back to Olson Highway, this is what we have now. And in a way, it's sort of like a little bit of what was lost. And this is a bit of a teaser of Kristen's great story, but it's really interesting to think about what was there, the way Clarence Miller drew it versus what we have now, which is a highway that is barely used, that doesn't work for the community, that leads to a lot of fatal crashes, and that has left the community sort of struggling economically. And for example, I'm going to talk about this more a little bit, but now we have a lot of data showing that people who live along highways are often the most harmed by climate impacts and health impacts, including the heat index around those areas. So to kind of finish up this portion and move into our work at our streets, here is a map of sort of this reconcentration of those communities that I showed earlier, with an overlay of the interstate system in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And as you can see, again, Olson Highway is sort of on the left graphic atop where you see a deep purple. That's the near north community. But then the other community that's been really well archived and story has been told quite a bit is the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul, which is on the bottom right. There's also a concentration of purple. So as you can see, a lot of the communities, because of the racial covenants and the migration that was forced onto these communities, ended up living exactly where the highways were built. And this was sort of an intentional process to harm these communities. And I'm going to move on to some of the work that we're doing at Our Streets Minneapolis. Obviously, as I was introduced, we are talking about reparative justice and putting marginalized communities first and elevating them so that they can enjoy the same amenities that a lot of other communities that, for example, benefited from racial covenants have been enjoying for generations. And as we continue to work, we start to build more and more models around how to think about transportation infrastructure decisions and these changes as an opportunity to reimagine the entire landscape of these communities, because oftentimes when these investments come through, they lead to gentrification, they lead to more displacement. So we're thinking holistically about how we approach work on a right-of-way so that it isn't just transformed to improve multimodal traffic, but it's also changed in a way that allows communities to speak for themselves and seek justice and self-determination and wealth building opportunities as well. So getting into some of the things that were kind of promised when the highways came through, as you all probably know just as much as we do, none of these things came through in terms of the promises that were made when the highways came along. In fact, quite the opposite. And the question that we started to ask ourselves is, you know, if these jurisdictions came together to do so much harm to these neighborhoods, you know, how can we find a way to sort of come together to repair these harms? And if these communities were demonized for so long, how can we come together and start telling the actual story of their neighborhoods so that they're once again perceived as humans that deserve the same level of equity and equal access to the same amenities that other community members have enjoyed across the Twin Cities? And in particular, in the near north, we have a situation where there's a huge housing crisis. The disinvestment has led to people living with some of the lowest household income, some of the basically largest disparities in home ownership and adequate housing in the community. And how do we take that sort of history of repeated displacement and repeated harms and address it sort of holistically through a project? And last but not least, the promises of improvement. For example, the Blue Line rail extension, we have a light rail here in Minneapolis, was promised to go down Olson Memorial Highway and bring new investment, and also the safety improvements that people have been asking for. This did not happen. In fact, it led to more speculation, and over 200 immigrant families were displaced. So they got no light rail, they got no safety improvements, and they got more displacement just recently. And then more than that, how do we address the greater issue? Communities in these areas are ingesting the largest amount of greenhouse gas emissions because they live surrounded by many highways. They're traversed by highways themselves. And so they have the highest asthma hospitalization rates in the metro area. Highways don't serve them because they have the highest number of households without car access. People can just not afford to own cars in that area. And like I was saying earlier, we have the highest amount of community members living in poverty. And because of all of these harms, we also have some of the lowest life expectancy in the Twin Cities. And the list of harms just goes on and on. And so we see here that this history of racial covenants, of displacement, of segregation, highway infrastructure, all sort of merges at the intersection of course, racial and economic inequities. And this is a little bit about the high injury crash network. So we set out to ask ourselves, how can we get back to this when we're in this situation presently? And so we launched a vision in partnership with the community members called Bring Back 6 or Bring Back 6th Avenue. We compiled all of the concerns into a two-phase vision to basically ask jurisdictions to come together and bring near-term safety improvements that would make it more accessible, more multimodal for that area. And a second phase that's sort of guarded by housing and anti-displacement benchmarks to restore the old neighborhood to communities' benefit. This I'll skip a little bit. This is sort of our general approach to advocacy for the sake of time. But our main partner was Harrison Neighborhood Association. They came to us first talking about footbridges. We ended up with this campaign to sort of, the way we describe it is, you know, part of our effort to expand community imagination about what's possible. Often marginalized communities don't have the resources or the energy because they're so oppressed to think deeply about what's actually possible. And so we host events in the community. We created a mobile history museum with some of Kirsten's research, with some of Heritage Studies and Public History research at the University of Minnesota. We do a lot of door-to-door knocking and engagement to basically bring this idea forward to the community and then go back and put them in a position where they can ideate about the things that they would like to see in their neighborhoods. And we bring all of that back to the office, and we leverage all of that energy, all of that ideation, and bring it to decision makers and agencies and make sure that they start thinking about what the community wants and take action. And it's in fact helped quite a bit. We went from no awareness about this community all the way to, as of today, there's a city resolution to decommission Olson Highway and start considering a major reconstruction. We're still a long way from there, but it's going through Minneapolis City Council as a result of this work and as a result of this community engagement. And of course, as a result of this storytelling that we've been able to benefit from through these partnerships. So a little bit about the first phase really quickly. As you can see, paint crosswalks. Kansas City's been doing it very successfully, helps reduce fatal crashes by up to 50%, according to their data. Protected bike lanes. For people who cannot afford to own cars, it's really beneficial to have bus-only lanes. We advocate for fare-free transit at Our Streets Minneapolis. So there's kind of the long list of it. And right now, crossing the highway is completely accessible for people who are on wheelchairs. So we are also being quite specific about the fact that it needs to be accessible and the pedestrian intervals just need to be longer. For example, I cross Olson all the time. It can take 7 to 8 minutes and it's still an unclear road. There's still moving traffic while I have a walk sign across the highway. So imagine if you're a person on a wheelchair or somebody who's moving a little bit more slowly, you're basically risking life. So here's a little bit about the crosswalks in Kansas City. They've been helping us a lot in terms of some grant seeking and other ideas for how to leverage our advocacy to get some of these done. And then the second phase is just restoring the corridor, keeping the public land public. There's a huge need for public housing and affordable housing in the area. And like I was saying earlier, 394 exists just south. There's another way for through traffic to get through. And one of the things about doing these kinds of campaigns is that we do the work and the research to make sure that communities understand how these things are feasible. Marginalized communities often don't think that anything good is ever going to come their way. So we do a thorough job of bringing a lot of information so they understand, no, this is possible. MnDOT, the Minnesota Department of Transportation, can afford to do this for you all. And so we basically look for funding sources and come to community explaining how the system can work in their favor and to try to help them motivate themselves to advocate for themselves ultimately. So I'll go quickly through this again. This is a little bit longer than a half-hour presentation. There's been overwhelming community support for this. People have been asking for safety improvements, so we're excited about that. And to kind of finish up, I'm gonna cut this up just a little bit and skip over to pause and then have some questions because you're all very transportation savvy folks. So I think the last thing that I'll add is, the question that we often ask people in the community, in terms of righting these wrongs and repairing these harms, is that ultimately there's going to be a small trade-off, of course. And again, the slide will awkwardly show up, but it's that what we've learned through these covenants and what we've learned through these decisions and how they were done intentionally is that there have been some community members, primarily white and wealthy folks, who have enjoyed generational wealth, who have enjoyed housing near a lot of amenities, who have never had to struggle with asthma or lower life expectancy. And, so the first question that we always ask community members to start to try and create some class solidarity or some solidarity across the cities on behalf of these communities that have been harmed the most is, what are you willing to do to help these communities enjoy the same amenities or get an opportunity at generational wealth or affordable housing or adequate housing? And so that's part of the reason why we rely so heavily on storytelling, is because these communities have not just been destroyed and harmed, they've also been sort of classified and portrayed as subhuman. So we have to sort of elevate them as deserving of the same equity, across the Twin Cities. And so telling the story of who they actually were versus how they were portrayed is really critical. But the other question that we ask folks, it always comes up, how are we going to get around? What's going to happen to traffic? Obviously, when you switch to multimodal, the time changes a little bit, but there's a moral question underneath, isn't there? Are you willing to give up 3 to 5 minutes of driving time in a multimodal boulevard if you're going to continue to drive, to allow for these communities to see an opportunity to restore their neighborhoods, restore their cultural vibrancy, have access to an economy? And so that way, we're not just framing transportation against itself, we're really framing these transportation decisions against how they impacted communities and all of these potential positive outcomes. And ultimately, that's how we approach our work, is always guided by a positive vision so that people have something to strive for. And all of these harms and all of these political obstacles and all of these funding pathways are just part of a process that lead to something better. And we always make sure that we're talking about things that are feasible, to make sure that it's grounded in political pathway reality, so that we're not going into the communities and just extracting or selling them ideas that are possible. So we take on a lot of that work, but it's a way to bring community members together, whether they live in the community that's been impacted or they live outside the community, around something that sort of brings them together to sort of help each other out through consciousness, storytelling, and awareness of one another. So I'll pause there, and thank you so much for the extra time. I know I went like 7 minutes over here, but thank you so much.
No, this is incredible. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I know it looks like Clyde has a question. Do you want to kick it off, Clyde?
Yeah, I was, you mentioned that the Blue Line extension project didn't happen. And it's been my visits to the Twin Cities is they seem to have a very vibrant light rail streetcar system. And so I was curious, why didn't the Blue Line extension take place? And then you also mentioned that in that process that more people were displaced. And I just didn't quite follow the reasoning behind that.
Yeah, so thank you. The route is now under consideration through another area. So it's farther north. So it's where West Broadway is in North Minneapolis. The same kind of concerns have emerged from local business owners. So it's a different part of North Minneapolis. So that's what happened with the route extension, excuse me, decision. And the reason why it led to more displacement is because when the route was announced, speculators came through, developers came through, and prices skyrocketed. And so folks who were at a time able to afford the housing that they had, all of a sudden were completely displaced from their housing, and it was very swift. And so it was kind of unfortunately, like the fourth or fifth major event in that same area. And I'll mention this really quickly. We have, because you're talking about the vibrant light rail, we agree it's a great resource for Minneapolis. The Green Line also had very similar issues where some of the communities were not considered. It was sort of doubling down on the displacement of Interstate 94, which is just parallel to the Green Lines. Curiously enough, some of the people that were contracted to build the Green Line were highway builders, who oftentimes, unfortunately, they're not the kinds of individuals who take non-drivers into consideration. And obviously, the same agency that destroyed all of these communities. But yeah, it was a lot of speculation and investment in new housing. And it's really bizarre if you go to North Minneapolis. I live in the neighborhood. Because there are areas that are still, there's a couple of buildings left that were on Olson, and a lot of the houses are really struggling. And then there's these really nice areas, like a really nice brewery and this really nice new housing where the community sort of changes, that folks just kind of moved in because of that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. Mariana, do you want to go? You got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. This is like an extremely technical question, so sorry ahead of time. When it comes to painted crosswalks, our Public Works Department says that those are they won't consider them. We've asked, and we know that other cities obviously can do them. Our Public Works Department says that whatever year the what is it, the MUTCD, the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, that we adhere to, like, does not allow for painted crosswalks. Do you happen to know what code or manual Minneapolis is using, or if they are using MUTCD, like ways that they're working around to find a way to do painted crosswalks?
Well, I could tell you Minneapolis is not looking to do that. We've just started to advocate for it because our transportation policy manager, Alex, reached out to the folks in Kansas City. But what I can definitely do, I and by the way, you're welcome to follow up. See if we can put you in touch with those folks, because what they did basically, I think it was a Bloomberg grant that supports these kinds of it's I think it's called the Asphalt Project Grant, and so you have to find a partner within the city to do it. But in Kansas City, they first brought it through as a pilot. And then it was like letting the community kind of sit with it and then making the decision. But what you're talking about, I'll have to get back to you on that. So if you don't mind sending that question via email, we'll get you a better answer, because we're not at the point where we're just starting to engage with one of the city's departments to see if they want to do the application. So we've yet to get any pushback on it and any of these like rationalizations like you're describing. But I think we can help with that for sure.
Awesome, thank you.
I can definitely put you in contact, Mariana. That's a great question. Cindy in the chat is kind of giving you some context about the culture in Omaha. We have a very car-centric culture, but probably much more so than Minneapolis even. We do things like, adjusting traffic light timing to help everybody get to their destinations faster and faster. And when people move faster, that creates more unsafe conditions. And I think the question is, what other things has our streets done to kind of start a conversation about this culture of wanting to get faster everywhere by car, and maybe different strategies for how we might think about combating that here.
Yeah, sure. And again, happy to share some of the research. The things that come up are definitely driving time, the amount of traffic. Everyone's always concerned about there's going to be some traffic jam or whatever. And then also parking. It's like this thing. I'm a musician up to starting this job a few years ago. So I've been talking about parking for 3 years, it feels like, almost every day. So one thing that we always talk about, and I was describing, is like, what kind of positive things can you leverage to bring some level of reassurance? One of them is the potential economic impacts of multimodal right-of-ways. So for example, a lot of people who are workers, they're very transit reliant. So employee retention is always better when people have better access to transit. When we're talking about things like speed limits and safety, we have a little graphic that's like at 25 miles per hour, 1 in 10 people are likely to die from a crash. At 40 miles per hour, it's 9 in 10. So to give clear information about what are the merits of having completely different speed limits. On the higher level, when we're talking about these major conversions for highways or other things, we've also it's the University of Minnesota Duluth finished a study around converting 1 mile of highway corridor 35 to a boulevard. And let me see if I can find it here in the presentation. It's staggering to hear the potential impacts of 1 mile of conversion. But we've started the conversation of, what can actually happen if you make these sorts of changes and make these kinds of investments. Gosh, this is going to be an awkward minute, but I want to find it. And I can also share you in that information.
Yeah, that sounds good. We're going to write a blog about this, so I can include that there.
Yeah, it's another thing. I know this is turning into a meeting. We're writing a blog of this particular study and happy to share it with you so you can see the person who helped spearhead the study. But a 1 mile conversion would cost $50 million. It could lead up to $4.5 billion in economic benefits, 450 new jobs, $20 million in labor income, nearly $39 million in GDP, and $74 million in new spending. So it pays for itself and then some. But to talk about the other couple of things, The way, in terms of reimagining corridors, traffic evaporation versus induced demand. You know, what does changing something to multimodal do? Well, if there's the right density of developing around an area, people just choose not to drive because they're able to walk places or they're able to access places through reliable transit. And so that's why we're starting to talk more and more about how the entire corridor can be reimagined outside of the sidewalks, because that kind of redevelopment then leads to real significant changes in mode shift. And in terms of, I think that was baked into the question too, but the other thing is that, well, for example, we sometimes look at city studies about how parking is used, and we can basically tell that during peak hours, not all the parking is used, so that there's a good discussion about the fact that it's not really going to have a serious impact on the ability for people to drive by car. But the other thing that we found, I think it was a study or an article out of Oregon, is that the biggest spenders in local businesses are people who don't drive because they have leftover income from not having to pay $9,000 to $12,000 for gasoline and car maintenance and all these things. So we're starting to get better and better to talk about that. And then we also like to talk about the communities that are most impacted, you know, these marginalized BIPOC communities and local business owners, and what the benefit is to them, because often these people are kind of erased. Like almost 30% of Minneapolis cannot afford to own a car. What about them? Almost 10% of the community identify as having a disability. They have to get around too. And so we try to talk about the impacted community members, but by and large, you know, the best path forward, I think, is always to leverage information with community consent. So the door knocking is really critical. You know, when leaders are hearing from the community's members at large, and you're bringing convincing information to the doors, then they start to feel a little bit more pressure to kind of advocate for their constituents.
Mhm. Yeah, Aben put that study in the chat and agree those are really helpful examples. I was actually wondering if you wouldn't mind going back to your slide on your approach to advocacy and kind of talking to us a little bit about that. That's a priority of mode shift. So yeah, thinking about your methodology would be, I think, really helpful for the group.
Yeah, let me do the awkward thing again here. I know I can see it there. Okay. I swear I made this slide deck. It's just there's like 100 slides, so I get a little lost myself. Okay, so here it is. We're very careful in making sure that we're doing research and we're building partnerships. And all of the materials that we were going to take out to the community members before we start. And that's really important to have like a whole messaging plan, a whole organizing plan, and the feasibility aspect of whatever project we're advocating for it to be ready to go. There you see community benchmarks, just because there's, of course, a lot of new urbanists in Minneapolis, but oftentimes in those spaces, they don't take into consideration what I was talking about, displacement and gentrification. So we try to disrupt that community by saying, no, you can't just advocate for nice things and then for people to get forced out. So the community benchmarks are basically anti-displacement benchmarks, for example, or community land trusts or commercial land trusts, to make sure that the wealth and the development is held for the community's benefit, so those marginalized folks actually get the benefit and stay where they are. When we launched the campaign, basically whatever our canvassers are doing is supported by what we're doing through digital communication. So you're welcome to go through our social media and kind of have a look around at the campaign specific content. That's basically built into the same literature that our canvassers are door knocking. And so decision makers are getting tagged on social media. As a team, we're emailing them. But at the same time, canvassers are knocking doors and they have QR codes and opportunities for folks to check in either through Action Network, or we share phone numbers of these decision makers. We're getting better and better at data collection, so we can basically show that broad support. We have a free version of an application called Reach, which is mostly used for political organizing, which is kind of where I come from. So our work kind of is a bit of a hybrid of like traditional nonprofit advocacy, a little bit of protest, a little bit of political organizing, and of course, a lot of positive visioning. We work with urban planners as volunteers who help us make these beautiful renderings that we use. They're quite inspirational. It's a great way to engage people. You know, a big part of how people first engage is a visual aid. And then, of course, as you all know, because you were talking about public works, when these departments and jurisdictions, you know, they make decisions, they often go to sort of the wealthy stakeholders, the people who have time out of their day to go to a noon meeting that's held by Public Works, or an info session held by the DLT at 1 o'clock. But working people have to work during the day. So we try to host events and forums for poor and working people, everyday people, to be able to have access to the same information, which is kind of another way of saying, if I can speak casually, it's like a lot of the work that we do is basically modeling what we think these departments ought to be doing themselves with their millions and billions of dollars. You know, at our streets, we have a small budget, we do what we can, but in reality, and we included in our benchmarks, our position is that these decisions should be made with broad community consent across racial and economic spectrum in the communities that are going to be impacted by these projects. And so, you know, an entity like the city of Minneapolis or the Minnesota Department of Transportation ought to be able to publicly demonstrate that they have broad consent and support for their ideas. And often it's the case that they don't, because they're really not only just pushing car-centric infrastructure, but they're kind of upholding a system of commodities, right? The oil industry or the lithium industry, they need space for those vehicles to move through, but that doesn't really take into account the community, where it's like, if you go back to the economic benefits of a conversion, that's sort of like re-democratizing that wealth. You know, all of a sudden, there's obviously a financial benefactor, but it's just more well distributed across the community. More small businesses can emerge. More people have access to the right of way, can do different things and move more easily and comfortably. And so, while we don't often think at that very, very high level, you know, that is why those decisions are coming down. You know, if the United States is investing so much money in extracting so much lithium, they need to have a way to funnel it into the economy. That's vehicles, you know, batteries for vehicles. But in reality, a lot of our community members who are poor and working class cannot even afford to own a car. Plus, electric vehicles themselves don't get us all of the way there. They produce emissions themselves. They're heavier vehicles. Extracting the minerals are not climate friendly tactics, you know. And we do advocate for electrification, but buses and bikes, you know, mass transit and other things. So our approach is basically like, what's the vision? And then we build a program to deploy it in a multifaceted way. And then once that's done, even though it's not graphed there, we go back. And then we start having these ideation sessions. We go into the neighborhoods and say, okay, let's take out the highway. What would you call your neighborhood if it was a multimodal boulevard? What kinds of things would you like to see? And now we're getting to that phase where we start re-rendering them. So the next set of renderings that we roll out are actually going to be made by communities. We're going to bring a quilting artist so they can leave a quilt of the community's version of their own neighborhood. And so now all of a sudden, in the second stage of our advocacy, we're literally just advocating for their ideas for their neighborhoods. And so now our streets becomes invisible. And all we're doing is using our expertise to prop up community's own vision for their own neighborhoods. And that's really, you know, that's really where it's at for us, is that we want to work ourselves out of a job through success. And as you all know, you know, the nonprofit complex sometimes can be the other way around. It's like they need the problem to profit, you know, to maintain self-preservation and existence. And I feel really lucky that I work with a small team who cares deeply about getting out of the way, but also understands that a marginalized community is not going to all of the sudden magically come up with transportation engineers or urban planners. So we bring just enough expertise to create the conditions for them to feel like they can fight for themselves, and we stay with them all the way through to success.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. I guess, yeah, folks are posting resources in the chat, which is great. I have, yeah, one kind of like higher level question that might be, kind of strange, but I think, you know, Mode Shift is obviously really different than our streets. We're much more grassroots. We don't have full-time staff. But I think for as long as I've been involved, we've been very reactionary to when something happens. We really try to, you know, collect people around whatever event just occurred and try to bring attention to it or educate people about it retroactively. And I'm wondering if you've had any conversations about this balance between responding to things that are happening in the community when they happen versus, you know, staying on your campaign and the vision and your priorities, and kind of how you talk about balancing those as an organization, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's something we talk about a lot. It's like almost the whole team. Our team is super neurodivergent, so we get super excited about the next thing all the time. It's like, you know, and how do you stay focused on what you're doing? But I think the other thing that you're implying, it's sort of the broader question of like, okay, even if we get one highway converted, that's one out of hundreds of highways in the country, right? And so what we're trying to do is scale our work to the degree where it can be duplicated. So volunteer efforts, we can say go in and resource them and say, okay, you can carry this work out at 252 and 994 or I-35 in Duluth or whatever. So that's one thing. We try to build a model that other people can take over to kind of spread the movement around as quickly as possible. And that's why we have all these logic models that to make it as shareable as possible, as quickly as possible. And then the other thing is that in the benchmarks in particular, but in general too, we try to always connect our work to overarching policy goals and guideposts, whether at the legislature, for example, the city of Minneapolis has a transportation action plan, which basically talks about the things that we're advocating for. It's just not funded. It just needs some dollars. And so we're always referring to these greater things at the same time and advocating for it to get funded while we're doing advocacy on one street or corridor. But that definitely took some building. You know, it's like we create positive visions around the corridor, but we try to connect them. So for example, we do this work on county corridors called County Streets for People that has now evolved into Streets for People in general. So it's city streets and county corridors, and it's also Open Streets Minneapolis, which is a great way to model a car-free street through an event. And we make sure that there's a little bit of that event component, there's a little bit of that information component, but we're always advocating for one corridor in the greater thing sort of at once, if that makes sense. It takes some work though, and I mean, because you're a volunteer only, that's always the issue. It's like, that's a lot of time. And I feel really lucky here. Like our transportation policy person, he's just that's all he does all the time. He's reading through policy all the time. And you know, I think he was a park ranger before he started. Like we all come from different backgrounds, but he's always been reading about climate and transportation. However, something that we're happy to support if you want to connect in the future, because Alex is really truly into and plugged in with what's going on across the country. We talk to Transportation for America all the time. We have great advisors, and he's a great individual resource, but also, you know, that's the best way to kind of try to hand over what we have in terms of that kind of thinking.
That's so generous. Thank you so much for offering that. And yeah, I'll say like it has been wonderful hearing you talk tonight and getting to chat with you. And we're just really excited to make connections with other folks doing this work in the Midwest. Yeah, I know we're at 8:01, so I want to thank Jose again for taking time out of your evening, out of office hours to come and talk to us. We really, really appreciate it. This is a really topical conversation right now. If anyone is in Slack, Ryan posted some articles in general, but the New York Times came out with a really great piece about American road deaths and the racial gap associated with that. It has some really wonderful maps from Omaha that display very clearly that we have the same problem, that in North and South Omaha, that's where the concentration of crashes and injuries and traffic deaths are also located. I don't know, Ryan, if you want to talk a little bit about those maps or where they came from, and I'll also upload them to the Zoom chat.
Yeah, those are maps that are coming out of a project that some students I'm working with students in my environment and society class. The some of the data comes from the Vision Zero study that's ongoing, and other forms of public data on racial composition. So those high injury networks are from the Vision Zero study. One of them, other interesting things that's a layer from that study is where a variety of types of safety improvements have been implemented. Some of those, like roundabouts, are clear out west where it's new development. They're easier to build, but it does show the racial disparities in those types of investments that we've made so far. I'm trying to find out more about what kinds of safety improvements are included and not included, and that would be important context for that. The other thing that shows up in this data, looking at some of the Justice 40 initiative mapping information, the clean transportation, disadvantaged communities very much in that North Omaha highway impacted area. Same patterns where the census tracts around the North 75 freeway are some of the lowest rates of car ownership in Omaha. So just a lot of parallels between what Jose has been talking about and what we're seeing in Omaha. I don't know if anyone mentioned, I first saw that some of those charts, looking stuff for the past week, I think some folks at UNO have started trying to do a mapping project in the last year of the racial covenants here in Omaha. I'm not sure how far they've gotten with that, but I think your guys' work was part of the inspiration for that, sounded like.
Kristen's real popular. We're just lucky to have a little time with her. I feel like she's giving presentations literally every week of the year. So like I see her every other Wednesday, and she's traveling before and just after. Definitely a person while connecting to. The 6th Avenue research was kind of a personal project of hers, but we found a way to connect it to the work. But absolutely, like, it's just a great way to leverage how things actually got to be to where they were. And another thing, I don't know if in your network, we've really benefited from those graphics. That's a college grad who specializes in GIS mapping, and it's great. They're super impactful. So if you've got someone or access to ArcGIS online or the software, it's just a great way to visualize all of that data in a way that's easily deliverable. We're launching, so stay tuned for that and definitely reach back out. We're launching an interactive version of that one. It's going to live on the website, and all of this data and then some. You can go in and do any layering that you want, or as little as much as you want, and move in around the city. But we think it's going to prove to be a useful tool. And it's true, it's a part of a national phenomenon, and so that's why we like to be in as many places as possible, is because we're all going through the same thing and trying to achieve the same things, and it's better to share resources as much as possible. So I salute you all for, as a volunteer group, doing this work, because it's a lot of work, but I think it's really worthwhile. And the best part about doing grassroots organizing, I can't say this enough, it's really connecting with people who are going through it and letting that kind of motivate you to get back to work and do the right thing. Community members are just the best experts in like how you should be grounded in the kind of work that we need to be doing.
Super well said. Yeah.
The last thing I forgot to add is that Spark CDI and some other groups in North Omaha together with the city have gotten a Thriving Communities grant to study the impacts of Highway 75 as a precursor to what to do about it. So I'm sure that that's something that ModeShift folks can potentially help with. And I've talked with them a little bit about trying to get a sort of central map repository as different groups are working on this to share data and try and make the most of the resources.
It's awesome. Thanks for
What is it called? Thriving Communities Grant?
Yeah, it's a federal Department of Transportation grant, I believe. Thriving Communities. They got together with the city and maybe MAPA. I forget who all is on it, but that'll be an important thing for ModeShift to support, I think.
That's awesome.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for your time. Thanks again to Jose. That was really wonderful. All of our gratitude and thanks. See you all at one of our many activities in May. Hopefully have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.